Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Wholeness Wisdom Podcast. My name is Erin, and I am an alternative practitioner in the methods of wholeness work and core transformation to help people discover the nature of who they really are in order to get through hard times in life, habits, and recurring patterns, in order to just live a little more lightly. The purpose of this podcast is to give everyday people some tips or areas of exploration to look at within their own lives that can help this transformation happen simply through self-investigation. So today's topic, I was inspired by a conversation I was having with somebody recently in a book club that discovers different up-to-date current philosophies and explores them in contrast to the physicalist philosophy. So in this group, we had a gentleman, and we were discussing paradigm shifts of personal belief systems. And as we were discussing these shifts in paradigms, and specifically in the topic of mental health, there were some practitioners there as well. This gentleman chimed in with his own experience of being a former diehard physicalist and getting to the point where he was seeking therapy for himself, unrelated to physicalism. He eventually landed in parts work, or IFS, which is internal family systems work. And in this kind of therapy, one learns how to communicate with habits or patterns or behaviors as if they are parts of themselves, and to have a dialogue with this while also holding the space as a higher reasoning or a higher logic or a higher self that is encompassing this part. And a keystone piece of this parts work is to welcome these parts of ourselves. So in order to have a dialogue, we can't be resisting the part. We have to welcome it in. So when we are identifying as a higher self that encompasses all parts, but is not limited to a single one, we can think of this in analogy to nature, because humans are a part of nature, an aspect of nature, but we are not all of nature. There's obviously the wind and rocks and animals and plants are all part of nature. Well, nature is this encompassing space or self-organizing principle within which humans are a part. The kind of work that we were talking about in this group for a little while, parts work, led to a change in this person's philosophy about life, which how I said before, was strictly physicalist or materialist. This man described going from this point of view that he had, physicalist mentality, to an all-encompassing one of idealism. Idealism means that the ideas of separation in the world are only that, ideas that are limited within a human scope of perception. Most of us know that the perception of a bee is different than the perception of a human. Bees can see infrared light, while we cannot. So the idealism is based upon the ideas of separation being limited because the human biology, in a sense, is limited from other types of nature. And we can think of this as the human mind being limited when contrasted with the mind of nature. Idealist philosophy stands by the notion that the universe itself is mental or intelligent in a different way than the human body can perceive through just strictly human perception. Indeed, the universe as we see it might look very solid and it might look very separate, but under idealism, in reality, is completely entangled and branching from the same tree, so to speak, of a universal mind rather than physical particles. In this conversation, talking about shifting paradigms and materialism and idealism and mental health, this is similar to the higher self that one identifies with while relating to a part of oneself in parts work. I would like to talk today about exploring our personal philosophy because this man really emphasized that there was a difference before this shift of personal philosophy and after how he approached the whole area of depression, sickness, and mental health for himself. He said before there was the idea, there's something broken with my brain. There's something wrong with my brain. And then after the shift, the question was naturally present, what is a solution? What is healing? What am I expecting when I'm considering my brain is broken and I need healing to fix it? That's what we'll talk about today. So generally, what do we mean when we talk about healing our mind or healing our psychology? Is there something broken that we fix, like a car? When we consider nature having a mind, nature itself, this all-encompassing force of nature, having a mind, not just humans, but nature itself, a mind that is intelligent and expanding and continually expressing in new ways, we don't think about nature fixing anything. We don't think about fixing nature. We think about nature learning in a new way to organize itself. And this is a different way of approaching healing when we really look at the idea of fixing something, because under physical realism, we are acting as though we are a car or an object that needs to be fixed, needs fixing. And to fix is to make work again, while to learn is to go from one complete learning, complete understanding, to growing that understanding or learning a new complete learning, one that encompasses a greater understanding. When we consider that nature is motivated to understand, learn, and express nature itself, we can see this actually happening through the human being. Humans are an expression of nature itself, so naturally humans' tendencies are to understand, and learn and express. While we are not the only thing in nature that understands, learns, and expresses. And while nature is not limited to the human being, we can understand that the mind of nature is not a human mind as we tend to think of it, which would be more of an egoic mind that is making decisions based on its own welfare. A human egoic mind is what we tend to think of when we talk about mind. But when we talk about the mind of nature, it is a mind, nonetheless. It is just divested of or does not contain that egoic mechanism, I could say. And it's also not dependent on a physical brain. When we say mind here today, we can, instead of a physical brain or an egoic mind, we can think of it like a neural network instead of a single thought. So instead of thinking of it as a single thought or a brain, we're thinking of it as a network or a web And neurons and networks of neurons, they're complex chains of associations. And just like this, nature can be considered a complex web of associations instead of one single phenomenon. We cannot look at one single phenomenon and say, that is all of nature. We understand nature already as a complex web of associations. An important distinction that we should make today as we talk about this is the actual purpose of science compared to the actual purpose of philosophy. So science's purpose is to predict what will happen next, while philosophy is for relating and understanding. It is about how we feel about ourselves and our relation to the world as we know it, and the meaning within that. So ourselves in regard to the world as we know it and see it, and the meaning within that. If we are only living to predict what will happen next, can we really call that living? Or is that more like a state of anticipation and analysis? A very important part of the scientific process is to be an objective observer. So an observer without any preconceptions about the result, but to be in an anticipatory state for that result to happen. We cannot be doing an experiment without some sort of anticipation of a result in order to measure it. Simply being an observer is being in an anticipatory state when doing science. Understand? So life itself, though, in comparison to the scientific process of measurement or predicting what will happen next, it's not fixed at all. It is in a state, or rather it is in a movement of flux all the time. And we cannot find anything in nature that is not a part of this complex web of movements. All of this is to say that it's important to understand that philosophy and science are two different schools of thought with two different purposes. And this being so, one does not cancel out the other. Philosophy does not discredit science. And science is useful, it is amazing, and we love to be able to predict what will happen next because it saves us a lot of energy, and it also solves problems. We can foresee the next storm, say, and be prepared. However, the purpose of examining one's philosophy is to connect to that world and ourselves from a place of inclusiveness and participation, not being an anticipatory, objective element to what's happening around us, but to be a participatory movement within the mind or the life of nature. And when we're resisting that movement or participation, when there's a lack of meaning because our personal philosophy is fixed, there tends to be patterns of avoidance, selfishness, and a crisis of meaning within oneself, which can feel like anxiety, it can feel like depression, it can feel like loneliness, or really feeling disconnected. Philosophy is useful in that it is really the exploration of ourselves, and it is so much closer to ourselves than the purpose of science, prediction, which is always forward. It is closer to ourselves, it is turning in, and it is really at the root of what we are. We can discover meaning. We can discover literally a world of meaning through examining our personal philosophy. And we can do this. And it is important to bring this up today for me because we are in a global crisis of meaning. And by bringing meaning back into one's life, each of us, one opens up the space for both understanding and learning and expressing in new, useful ways which impact life on a global scale. Why I say that there is a crisis of meaning today, that's not my term for it, but it really resonates when I read that, is that there is this vacuum of meaning in a lot of our lives today because the foundations of physics, classical physics, time, gravity, space, matter, consumed or overshadowed our personal internal philosophy. So while philosophy doesn't cancel out science, science has kind of, for some of us, subsumed our personal philosophy so that we've taken the purpose of science to be the meaning in one's life. And this is where we could get what is called a physicalist philosophy, where the predominant source of meaning in one's life is the realness of separation, the realness of separate objects, and there being nothing beyond the realness of matter and particles as we conceive them. Beyond this ultimately being empty and deprived of any real higher meaning, because particles and matter don't have any inherent meaning. We can't pull apart some particles or some object and find the meaning there objectively. Under a physicalist philosophy, it places ourselves in this predictive state of anticipation, kind of holding our breath, waiting for the results. And as the observer in the world, that says nothing about us or what our life is about. As you see, as we talk about this, when we question a philosophy, an internal belief system of physicalism as the basis of meaning for ourselves, for the purpose of understanding ourselves better, exploring our own internal philosophy or personal philosophy with a different purpose than to predict, we can shift how we approach our health, money, friendships, aging, all kinds of realms of life. We're going to talk today just on the level of health because that is where my friend's our discussion was going around his broken brain assumption. Returning to the conversation about this, the brain being broken when seeking therapy, when we are depressed, we can think that something is really, really wrong with us, or as he had said, my brain was broken. This friend then went on to talk about how when he worked with parts therapy, IFS, and met parts of himself from this higher self perspective or encompassing self perspective, he wasn't doing this with the goal of killing the part, making the part go away, or forcing it to change or learn. I mean, think about it. Treating anyone this way really isn't the best approach to fostering any kind of natural learning. If anything, it just creates more pathology or coping systems. When we overthrow the whole concept of healing and replace it instead with learning and welcoming and accepting and really feeling what is happening, learning is allowed to take place. And the mind of nature, so to speak, learning is a natural aspect of that, and self-organization is a natural aspect of that. So when we are able to welcome what is happening in our system of nature, our little global ecosystem, we are opening the space for that learning and understanding to happen naturally without any kind of force. When there is force, when there is resistance, there is this implied calcifying or freezing. It's a sort of freeze response, and all coping mechanisms of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are present in this rejecting of anything. When we are rejecting any parts of ourselves, even the rejection could be on a subconscious level, but when we're avoiding something within ourselves or really wanting it to change, this freezing happens on a nervous system level, along with fighting. That can look like fighting the world around us, people, relationships, freezing, fawning, and running away from situations continually, including our own selves. It is common to reject parts of ourselves as not broken. So it's common to reject parts as being already complete or fine. And in this case, a person could be afraid that if a part of ourselves isn't labeled this way, broken, it will never change. When we stay with that fear as its own part, a sensation in the body that is resisting another sensation, we open that space again in ourselves and at the same time identify as the context for both of these parts instead of one part keeping another part in check. Before I went into this field of work, I sought therapy for my own troubles, and I found myself wondering how long it would take for my problems to be solved, even before I ever met with a therapist. I would calculate how many months, how many weeks until the depression, the anxiety would be gone and I could stop. Now, after exploring my own internal philosophy and seeing a shift in it that naturally happened from my previous physicalist mentality around therapy, I understand that nothing is ever complete, and at the same time, nothing is broken. And I approach this with people that I work with today, clients. Nothing is wrong with them. And when that is the basis of our work, things tend to learn and naturally change so much more quickly. The understanding of this resonates in that space when we are the welcoming for parts of ourselves. The understanding resonates through that nothing is broken, and learning, welcoming becomes more of a state of the movement of life, of ourselves, so that when things around us are challenging, there is an easier ability to welcome, accept, and learn. From this space comes learning, and it isn't through an effort, but it is through a relaxing of fixing or resisting. Because again, we're learning to come out of that anticipatory kind of frozen state. When welcoming is taking place, there is no room for resistance. And understanding is a moment-to-moment experience. Understanding is always happening in the present moment. Understanding is not yesterday. Understanding is not tomorrow. Understanding is now, or it is what it is. There is no half welcoming, just like you cannot be half pregnant. There is not being half aware, and there's not being half open. In a single given moment, there is either openness or there is resistance. And as the moment changes, there's another opportunity to resist or to open again. You see, these are never fixed. The idea of fixed or solid is a physicalist philosophy. There is not a fixed understanding or a fixed ignorance. There are parts that see from a seemingly fixed view, but they exist in a context that is continuously flowing and being the context within which those parts are expressing. And I'll give an example here of this. It can seem as though we have many parts talking at once when we really only have one single sensation within our perception at a given moment. A question for you to examine this would be, could you have two thoughts at the same time? No. What we actually experience is a flow of perception. Thought, 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 thought. And while it can happen faster than a blink of an eye, there are not two simultaneously. And how do we know this? How do we know about the thought? We are present for the thought, right? And that which is present for the flow, thought, 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 has called this flow time. I'll say that again. What is present for the flow of thoughts, thought, 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 is present for the thoughts and has called this flow time. If you're not sure about this, let's just check for ourselves here. I'll give a different example. Instead of thoughts, the perception could be a smell. So when smelling a rose, are you the smell of the rose? Or what is aware of the rosy smell? If the answer is, I am the smell, how do you know? Does the smell smell itself? If you can see that you are what is smelling, you are identifying right then and there as the higher self. I actually don't like to say higher self, higher, because this implies that the self is above, which is physicalist. It's what I simply mean is the background of experience or the awareness that is encompassing the perception or a part of ourselves, while is not limited to it. Again, like nature, it's not limited to the human, but the human exists within the frame of nature. This self encompassing awareness is outside of time because, again, it is labeling this flow of perception as time, yet it is not time itself. It could not label those flows of perception time if it was also flowing as one of those perceptions. So awareness, higher self, is outside of time while being aware of the flow of perceptions called time. And the good news is, I would like to share with you, is that we all have access to this awareness, higher context, encompassing self. And we have no requirement necessary to be aware of this. We don't need to do something special to be aware. And this is why. In order for you to be listening to my voice, you must be conscious. In other words, to be speaking, there must be animation. Even before the words come out of me as sound, there is a space in which the words can form from a mental sound that only I hear to a verbal one. And the background of all phenomena is this consciousness or animation. Without consciousness, there would be no way to report that anything is happening. Everything that I just said in the last 30 seconds, there would be no way to report that without consciousness of that. So consciousness is the only constant. And here we could substitute the word awareness, as I used it just a few minutes ago, for this consciousness. It is the only constant context. And there's no requirement because you are that context always. See? Consciousness is the only constant, and actually science, with its purpose of predicting, it leverages this constant as well, since there must be an objective constant observer who does not change in order for the experiment to be documented accurately, measured. So consciousness is the single constant. To bring this back to well-being, when we think about a brain, say my brain, as being broken, we are thinking in fixed terms about the brain, or physicalist terms, and we try to make the brain into a constant, either good or bad, well or unwell, broken or fixed. All of this happens while there is never a fixed perception. One is always running forward into the next, and there is no perceptible border between one perception and another. So the constant, or the fixed label we attribute to the brain, is incorrect. It's only a label, or a conceptual label, idea of constancy. And we can try to find a line between a single thought and another and never succeed. So our perceptions are in this flowing, moving, changing way, along with how the brain is, the state of the brain, the state of the mental state. It is never fixed. And when saying my brain is broken, we're taking for granted that the brain actually is fixed. There's a way for it to be. You see? Even still, the mind labels things so it can pretend that there is something fixed. And this is what the mind does. It isn't wrong. It is just a labeling function of the human mind. When really looking at this, one can realize that the idea of complete healing is a label that isn't possible in the greater mind of nature. No labels exist in nature. Human brains do this. Nature doesn't. We create labels for things to make life easier, predict what will happen next, but also to impart our lives with a sort of constructed meaning. We add labels to inject some meaning into life when we're coming at it from a physicalist worldview. And one of the reasons for this is because humans really like closure. This is explored by idealist philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, and he says that closure is what gives a sense of meaning to people. And we do this in a specific way, many different ways. But one example is the way we honor our dead and transport bodies overseas, for example, to give them a proper burial, to give ourselves some closure. There are also certain agreements in society, such as punishments, laws that fit the crime. And a lot of this is to give meaning and closure, meaning through closure, for the families of the victims. However, when we look closely at what closure is, it is a ritual. It is symbolic for the purpose of generating a sense of meaning through given actions. And the meaning is deeper and greater than the actions themselves. So what about real meaning that doesn't involve ritual, but just a general inherent sense of meaning in our lives? This is the purpose of philosophy. Well, science is to predict what will happen next. Philosophy is to incorporate a sense of meaning and understanding about one's life within the scope of life. This is what I'm encouraging everyone listening to do, and myself included personally, is to explore one's personal philosophy. What gives meaning in your life? What are you connected to? And that you connect to something that is greater than your inner parts. What does that look like? Are you in touch with the encompassing awareness that includes all parts? Parts that want meaning, parts that resist certain emotions or thoughts? Are you identifying with a single perspective or personality trait? Philosophy is not just getting distracted by ideas, but it is actually an invitation to see beyond the idea of the world, and much more importantly, to turn inward. And this is necessary to tune into meaning that is already present in our lives, that we've kind of just jumped over in favor of an objective, solid, fixed, labeled world. It is necessary to tune into the meaning in our lives, to go toward what we've been avoiding in order to allow peace to touch us in the space we create through doing this. When we live in anticipation of what will happen next, we are avoiding what is now. And we will always fail and feel a sense of lack and discontent when we go about it that way, even though the mind, it may take many years to notice this subtle discontent below the surface. Because the nature of the mind is to think spontaneously, but never, ever, ever predict the future, we cannot get a sense of meaning going that way by trusting thoughts. We can, however, find a deeper connection to ourselves and be truly at peace in our lives when we earnestly and openly ask, what is my life about? Where is the meaning in my life? Where do I fit within the context of the whole? And is there anything that could be broken? What is life about when we consider healing to be a label that doesn't really have any actual substance in reality? When we conceive that the world is actually the idea of separateness from human limitations, while what is really there is completely and inherently connected, what could be broken? The images that we see on the screen of perception could actually be pointers to something that is really deeply meaningful that we do have access to if we learn and welcome and allow it to show up. What used to be called depression or meaninglessness could become awareness of a lack of validation in oneself for the actual sensations that are happening on a physical level, an emotional level. What becomes a solution when we regard it this way? Opening the space in ourselves by being awareness of sensations and emotions, identifying as the context that encompasses a flow of perception, and witnessing the movement of nature as it happens despite an egoic self, and in participation with and of an integrated whole self, which is beyond the body, but extends into the whole mind of nature, which is expressing through us. So this purpose of this episode. I usually like to leave people with something to do. And this is a little more open. So today, I just really want to encourage people to explore the meaning in their lives and also be open to the concept of healing in general. Because a lot of people come to me and they tell me about all the problems that they're having right now. And why isn't this fixed yet? Or why is this still an issue for me? I've seen all these therapists and practitioners. Why is this still an issue for me? And that really lets me know that their internal philosophy is relying heavily on a physicalist philosophy. That their brain, their emotions is like a car with a broken part. And they're coming to me as though I'm the mechanic or the supplier, and I've got a new part for them. And part of the work at first is to just tune people into that awareness, the capacity to experience life that is always present for every perception. And while it may sound complex, it is not complex, because what is hearing these words right now is that. If you can be aware of that, what is hearing these words right now, there you go. So I hope you've liked this episode. I always appreciate people reaching out. So if you would like to leave a comment on this video, please do. Please like and share. It really helps me be seen and heard for other people to receive some help if they need it. And also you can send me a message, go to wholenesswisdom.com. Also, at the beginning of this video, I talked about a discussion group. This is free to the public. It is on Zoom the third Friday of every month, 12 Eastern. If you would like to join, please go to connectcreatewholeness.com for the Zoom link. Thanks so much. It's been so good connecting with you here today. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a really nice rest of your day.